for Kevin Cleveland, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, for this time that we have to send one to study the Word. We ask that you be with Brother David as he directs our minds, that we go through these things, and that we can find things we can apply them to our everyday life. Thank you so much for Jesus, for his blood that was shed on that cross. We have to do this for sin. In his name we pray. Amen.
Okay, so let's start now looking at verses 1 through 3. It says, if there is a controversy between men, and they come to judgment, and they have been judged, and the righteous is declared righteous, and the wrongdoer is declared guilty, then it shall be, if the wrongdoer is worthy to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to fall down, and one shall strike him in his presence enough for his wrong by a certain number. He may give him 40 stripes, no more, lest he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes. Then your brother would be dishonored before your eyes. So basically what we're talking about here is there's some type of controversy or some type of problem between two people, men is talked about here. And because of this controversy or this crime or whatever, it's brought to judgment. In other words, it's brought before the court, and there's some type of judicial ruling that's going to be made. So the judge is going to judge the situation based on, I guess, the preponderance of the evidence, and they're going to make a decision. And you'll notice here that it talks about a judge, but in most cases it was actually judges. And normally in the lower type of courts, there was never less than 3 judges to make the decision. Of course, the more serious the crime, it would kind of move up the chain of command until it could possibly get to the Sanhedrin there, and obviously later in Jerusalem. And there were 71 judges in the Sanhedrin. But this is a lesser court. And some of the lesser courts had as many as 23, and some of the, I guess it would kind of be like in the magistrate courts there would be 3, in the circuit courts there would be 23, and then in the Supreme Court there would be 71. So as you moved up, there were more judges. So what they were going to do was they were going to look at the evidence, and they were going to declare who was right and who was wrong. So, and the righteousness here is used for somebody who did what they were supposed to do, who didn't break the law, and basically the one who was acquitted of the charges. But then we have one who is condemned of the charges and is worthy of punishment. In Proverbs 17 and 15 it says, "He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, even both of them are hateful to Jehovah." So basically, this was an important thing here that this be taken care of. We didn't want the criminal to go loose. We didn't want an innocent man to suffer. So what we see here, as far as the punishment goes, it was a situation where we had corporal punishment. And corporal punishment has been around for a long time. It's probably not as prevalent today as it was, in years past. I know, even in the schools, they had corporal punishment. I got to try that out a few times when I was in school. And, I understand now sometimes they call it arbitration. And I taught over Spring Valley one semester, and the little girl who was the assistant principal was telling me she was arbitrating the situation. I was sitting there thinking, yeah, I remember arbitrations about that long, about that wide, and about thick, and you got 3 arbitrators. So, but we don't do that anymore to our children, because it might give them a bad self-esteem, I guess. But anyway, back then and there, our corporal punishment was definitely one of the things that we were dealt with. And the guilty man was going to be sentenced to stripes, which means there were going to be some type of whipping or beating. The other thing we kind of note from this is that it happens pretty quick. There's doesn't look like there's much of an appeal. The judgment is made, and then the punishment takes place. It's kind of like when somebody was going to be stoned to death. They didn't, languish in prison for years and years and years before they were put to death. It was pretty much a instant gratification type of deal. Now we see here that the maximum penalty is laid out, and that would be 40 lashes or to be beaten 40 times. The number 40 was not to be exceeded, and that was very important because it was a matter of honor that you were degrading the person if you did more than the 40 lashes. And this was the acceptable number that was given from Jehovah. There's been a lot of things written about where that 40 came from, but when you got to the point where you were getting 40 lashes, that was a pretty severe punishment that was going to be executed on a prisoner. Probably the number 40 was chosen with reference to the symbolic significance of 40 days and 40 nights of the rain and the punishment that God did when they flooded the earth. Most of the scholars seem that this goes back to Genesis 7 and 12. It says, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So that kind of represented the full measure of punishment. Now, the strokes were to be administered with a stick upon the back. And there's several references in Proverbs that talks about this. Well, one of them is in Proverbs 10 and 13. It says, in the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod for the back of him who is without understanding. In Proverbs 19 and 29, it says, judgments are prepared for scorners and stripes for the back of fools. And Proverbs 26 and 3 says, a whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for a fool's back. So, pretty much the punishment was done with some type of rod. Now, the scholars seem to think that the way that they did this back then, they kind of went back to the Egyptian mode of doing a whipping, where they took the culprit, they laid them either flat on the ground or on some type of bench. Somebody held their feet, somebody held their arm, and they administered the strokes that way. And I think where they kind of came up with that is looking at some of the hieroglyphics that were on some of the pyramids and things like that. There was depictions of that type of with that type of punishment. Now we see here that the number was set at not more than 40, but we know in the New Testament that this was such a sacred type of situation that you did not go over 40. That the rabbis, by the time that it came around to the time of Jesus, it was 40 save one. So in other words, they gave him 39. And that way, if somebody wasn't a very good counter, they wouldn't go over, because to go over was just a really bad situation as far as the way that the Jews looked at this situation. And we know from 2 Corinthians 11 and 24, Paul was talking. He says, 5 times from the Jews I received 40 stripes minus 1. So that's where the 39 came in. Comments or questions about those verses?
I wonder who administered, the lashes. It was like, the other, if you're right to the judges, with 2 witnesses, you were stoned. The witnesses cast the first stone.
Right.
I wonder if the ones that were bringing charges were the ones that...
It may very well be, because it says it's done in the presence of the judges, but it didn't say that the judges did the punishment. So I don't really know on that.
We don't read of them having a constable,
right?
Anybody that would execute.
Right.
They might
have had some guy with a hood on their head and all that kind of good stuff. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 4. It says, you shall not muzzle an ox when he treads out the grain. So basically, that sounds like there's not a whole lot there in that verse, but there really is, okay? The first thing we need to talk about is, the people back then understood exactly what was being talked about here. In that day and time, when they would mill the grain, they would have an ox that would go round and round in circles, and it would run the wheels that would grind the grain. And of course, when the corn or the grain or whatever would some of it would fall on the ground, well, as the oxen was walking around, it would eat a little bit. Okay, so basically, what Moses does here, he forbids the people from muzzling the ox so that the ox can't eat as it goes around and around the circle, running the mill. And the point of this is kind of a symbolic thing here, where it's talking about how you treat your servants and laborers. You treat them the way that they should be treated, and you don't mistreat them. Because God here gave this to Moses, this instruction. So God cares for the animals, and He cares about how the animals are treated. So if He cares about how the animals are treated and how we treat the animals, then He obviously compares and cares about how we treat each other and how we treat our workers. Now, Paul expounds on the significance of this command in 1 Corinthians 9 and 9 and 1 Timothy 5 and 18. In 1 Corinthians 9 and 9, it says, for it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads the corn. Doth God take care for the oxen? And what he's talking about here, we're talking about treating people right. And in 1 Timothy, it's 1 Timothy 5 and 18, it says, for the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. So, we need to be conscious about how we treat people who work for us, and that we treat them right. And and obviously back then they took care of their animals, because their animals were a very important part of their livelihood. So Moses here is not only talking about the ox and how it needs to be treated, but it moves on over to how people need to be treated. So the purpose clearly was not only to provide for the ox itself, but to make the point by an argument that if a mere animal was worthy of humane treatment, how much more was a human being created in the image of God worthy of good treatment. So there's a lot in that. There's a lot in that verse, and there's a lot of good wisdom in there. Comments about that verse? Okay, we've kind of talked about all along that as Moses was writing these things here in Deuteronomy, he was kind of expounding on the Ten Commandments. So in verses 5 through 19, he's talking a little bit here and giving some advice and guidance on the 10th commandment. Ye shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. So there's 4 laws in this section, and all of them deal with desire or intention opposed to some type of deed. So in the first one, we're going to talk about a Levirate marriage. This is we're going to look at verses 5 through 10. And this Levirate marriage was a custom in ancient Hebrew where other people in the family were obligated to marry their brother's widow. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. So let's start with verse 5. It says, if brothers live together and one of them dies and has no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry outside to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife for himself, and perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. And it shall be, the firstborn whom she shall bear shall succeed the name of the dead brother, so that his name may not be put out of Israel. And if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate and to the elders and say, my husband's brother refused to raise up a name in Israel to his brother. He will not perform my levirate. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. And if he stands and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders and take off his shoe from his foot, spit in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build upon his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has his shoe taken off. So strange. It's exactly right. So this is a situation where you have a married brother and a single brother, and they live in the same household. And the one brother who is married dies. The other brother is obligated to take his wife, marry her, and have offspring, so that his firstborn will carry on his name, into the future. So this particular arrangement existed, even before the age of Moses. We can read it in Genesis 38:8. It says, and Judah said unto Onan, go into thy brother's wife and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. So this was something that had gone on before the law of Moses, but it was kind of put in the canon there after Moses was, after the law came about, and kind of formalized the procedure here a little bit. Now, there were several reasons for this levirate marriage provision, and the reasons were the importance of the descendant in God's purpose for Israel, the welfare of the widow, and the demonstration of love for one's brother. So this all kind of went together, and then this was something I think that most of the people in that day understood. Now, the Mosaic law rendered the custom as an obligation rather than an option, as it was before the law of Moses. And the younger brother or the nearest kinsman would marry the widow. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the youngest brother, but whichever brother would happen to be single. It wouldn't be proper for a brother who was married to take on another wife in this situation. So the word levirate comes from the Latin word levar, which means husband's brother. So the Israelites were to practice this levirate marriage only in cases where the brother had lived together, which is talked about in verse 5, and the remaining brother was not already married. Because what would be the situation if he was already married? It would be adultery, and that would be against the Ten Commandments. So if the brothers lived together and one of them died childless, the wife of the deceased was not to marry outside of the family. In other words, she wasn't to go out and marry a strange man, one that was not one of her kindred. Her brother-in-law would come to her, take her as his wife, and then perform the duties that his deceased brother would do. So presumably, the prohibition of sexual union with a brother's wife in Leviticus 18 and 16 and 20 and 21 refers to such an act while the brother is still living. So the brother had to be dead for this to happen. It's not a situation where this is going to happen while the brother is still living. So if the younger brother declined to comply with the law, then the widow brought her claim before the authorities in a public place. And we've talked about before that usually at the city gate was where the elders of the city would gather, and she would go and make her petition in public, to them, and declare that he had refused to follow the law. So, as in any court, both sides get to testify, and the brother comes up. He says, "I'm not going to marry her." Well, there's consequences for not following the law. So she was ordered to loose the thong of his shoe or take his shoe off, which was a sign of disgrace. And then she would follow that act up by spitting on the ground, which was really a strong form of contempt to the people, these Eastern people. And the shoe was kept by the magistrate as an evidence of the transgression, and the parties would separate. So he would walk around shoeless for a while, and that was part of his punishment. Yes, Gavin, that was a pretty strange situation.
Did you spit in his face? On the ground. King James says spit in his face.
Yeah, but I think it was spit on the ground. I don't think it was spit in his face. Yeah, and I think that from the different translations, the King James says spit in his face, but the other translations doesn't kind of indicate that. So I don't know.
That part of according to the commentators, that was part of the great humiliation to our Lord.
Mm-hmm.
When they spat on him,
Mm-hmm.
they spit on the ground,
Right.
spat on him.
Mm-hmm.
That was the worst humiliation you could get.
Yeah, and it still is. It's still so bad situation.
I think also for her to have a child, when they went over to the promised land,
Mm-hmm.
it's all about the inheritance too.
Right.
If she never had a man child,
Right.
she wouldn't receive any inheritance.
Right. She wouldn't have nobody to take care of her when she got old either.
So, it was a lot more than just not having a child.
Right.
It was her livelihood.
Right. Right.
So a man stand firm in that, you have that could it be that he was, this is guesswork here, but was betrothed to another person, they ever get married, stand firm.
Well, I mean, if he was betrothed to somebody else, that's part of the marriage process. I don't know. It's a little glad they do that now or then and not now. Any other comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to verses 11 and 12. When men strive together with one another, and the wife of one draws near to deliver her husband out of the hand of him who strikes him, and puts forth her hand and takes him by the secret parts, then you shall cut off her hand, your eye shall not pity. So basically what we're talking about here is we got a fight between two men. And they come to blows, and one of them, it sounds like, is getting the tar whipped out of him. So he needs a little bit of help, and his wife steps in and tries to help the situation out a little bit, and basically gets involved into the situation. So she gets in there and she puts her hands down by and grabs his secret parts, okay, and probably turns the tide of battle, as we might say. So this was absolutely a shameful act that she committed here by doing something like that, and it was really a pretty obscene gesture. So it was an immodest action done partly out of affection for the husband to kind of get the other person off of him, or to give the husband an advantage. And also, you'd have to think it was partly out of malice and revenge against the other person. And that was a situation that they looked very unkindly on. So if this did happen, the remedy for the situation was they were going to cut the wife's hand off. And I would suspect it was whichever hand that grabbed the private parts would be the one that would be, the one that would be unclean. So, even though it was maybe done in passion, and even though it was done in good intention, it was still going to be severely punished. And, it says, don't have any pity on her. She broke the law, and there should not be any, pity on her because, it was the wife or whatever. And it shows the justice, but it also shows that certain crimes, there is a severity that goes along with it, and that we shouldn't feel sorry for the people who get punished for committing a crime. Now, obviously, this is again a situation that's going to go before the magistrate. The magistrate is the one, from all the things I've read from the ancient commentaries, that they would bring this before the magistrate. The case would be made, and then if it was proven that this happened, then they would cut off the hand. Most of the things I've read after said usually they cut off the right hand, and I guess maybe that's because most people are right-handed, and that's probably the one that they would try to grab it with. So it's a bad situation to think about anyway. And there's other cases in the Bible where people did things trying to thinking it was the right thing, but it was the wrong thing, and it was there was a punishment that went along with it. So again, that's something that probably we don't think a whole lot about today, but it does happen. And you think about that's a pretty severe punishment, and it's going to cause a lot of hardship for the rest of that person's life. But it also points to the importance of modesty and chastity also. So God knew what He was doing when He made this law up. Comments about those verses? Okay, let's look at verses 13 through 16. You shall not have in your bag 2 kinds of weights, a great stone and a small. You shall not have in your house 2 kinds of measure, a great ephah and a small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure you shall have, so that your days may be lengthened in the land which Jehovah your God gives you. For all that do such things, all that do unrighteousness, are hateful to Jehovah your God. So basically what we're talking about here is we're talking about dishonesty with weights and measures. And the Israelites were to use the same weights and the same measures for both buying and selling. It's kind of like the deal where you go to the store and they measure something out, and the guy's got his thumb on the weight, so you don't get as much. And it talks about here, don't be in a situation where you're going to be unfair to the other person. Now, obviously, if you're buying, you want to get more than what you pay for. Okay, but if you're selling, some people want to give, kind of cut people a little bit short. That's what's being talked about here. And these stones were basically the weights that they were used to do the measuring with. The weights were ancient. They were made of stone. They were frequently still used in Eastern shopkeepers and traders who take them out of a bag and put them on the balance. You buy so many ounces. Well, that's so many stones. So if it's 2 stones, you put 2 stones on one side of the scale, and then you start putting whatever the ingredient is on the other side until it averages out. So the man who is not cheated by the trader and his bag of diver weights must be blessed with more acuteness than most of his fellows. So it's important that you do. You want to be known as an honest trader. there was usually, you don't want to be in a situation where you have two stones there, one large one for buying and a small one for selling. And of course, the ephah, we've talked about this before, is an ancient Hebrew dry measure equivalent to about a bushel. So, there's lots of ways that you can measure things out. But however you do it, you want to give the person a fair measure, and that's what God is talking about here. It's about the perfect and a just weight. So you give the person the full weight. And if you really want to be good about the deal, what do? You give them a little bit more. Okay, you give them a little bit more for their money. In Leviticus 19:36, it said, "Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt." So, Moses is just reiterating what was discussed in Leviticus about the weight. And there's a reward for the person who does this. And that reward is their days are going to be lengthened in the land. In other words, you're going to live a long life because you're honest with people. And, this is a blessing, and it's reckoned as a blessing with God that you do these, things. And it also shows your obedience and your fidelity to God by following the things that He said. Comments about those verses? Okay, let's look at verses 17 through 19. "Remember what Amalek did to you by the way when you came forth out of Egypt, how he met you by the way and struck those of you who were behind, all the feeble behind you, when you were faint and weary and did not fear God. And it shall be when Jehovah your God has given you rest from all your enemies all around in the land which Jehovah your God gives you for an inheritance to possess it, you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heavens. You shall not forget." So basically, the Israelites were to make love a guiding principle in their conduct in dealing with their neighbors. Not only with their neighbors, but with strangers, and also their foes to a certain extent. And they were not to denigrate into weakness or indifference toward open ungodliness. And to impress this truth upon the people, Moses concludes what we're talking about here, this discourse on the law, by reminding them of the crafty imagery that manifested toward them by Amalek. I mean, he treated the Israelites terrible. And on their march out of Egypt, who did he prey upon? He didn't prey upon the strong ones. He preyed upon the weak ones. And there's a really big lesson there is, we need to, treat people who have problems, treat weak people. We need to treat them with love, and we need to do things. We need to do things for them. And if they're feeble, if they're weak, instead of preying on them and making their lives more miserable, what we need to do is we need to lift them up and try to help them as much as possible. And we see here that Jehovah God hated this so bad that he wanted the remembrance of Amalek removed, and nobody ever want to think about him again. He had no legend. He had no standing, anywhere under the heavens. He was going to be blotted out of the remembrance of the people. Right. I mean, that's a pretty strong. That's a pretty strong statement that he was going to be blotted out for all of it. So we'll close here with Exodus 17 and 14, which says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek under the heaven." So what he did was so despicable in the presence of God and how he treated the weak, that God wanted him blotted out of the remembrance of everybody. And the whole nation, everybody. I mean, he wanted him completely out.
Saul was supposed to carry that out and
Didn't. But I mean, that's how disgusting it is when we treat people that are weaker than we are, and we take advantage of them and treat them wrong. Any comments about those verses? That's the end of the chapter. I'm going to let Bill pick up next week with the next chapter. So we'll quit here a little bit early. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.